The COVID-19 pandemic caught the world off guard, causing the biggest health crisis in a century. It wiped around $13 trillion off the global economy and claimed millions of lives. Vaccines offered a lifeline, but they didn't reach everyone. In this film, we ask 4 experts from different sectors how we can vaccinate the world in a future pandemic.
I'm Dr. Soumya Swaminathan. I'm the Chief Scientist at the World Health Organization.
My name is Jerome Kim, and I'm the Director General of the International Vaccine Institute.
My name is Achal Prabhala. I live in Bangalore in India. I work on access to medicines against pharmaceutical monopolies.
I'm Thomas Kearney. I'm Director General of IFPMA, the Association of Global Innovative Pharmaceutical Companies and Vaccine Manufacturers.
So I think one of the spectacular success stories that we've seen during the pandemic is the development and deployment of not just one, but dozens of vaccines using different platforms, and the speed and scale at which vaccines were tested through clinical trials, got regulatory approval, and then manufactured in bulk, shipped to countries. And when we see the end of 2022 that 70% of the world's population had at least one shot, then that really is an unprecedented achievement.
The technological achievements throughout the COVID pandemic are undeniable, but where we failed was in the distribution of vaccines to the world's most vulnerable populations.
While the COVID vaccination program globally is estimated to have saved about 20 million lives just in 2021 alone, the sad fact is that there were vast inequities, particularly in low-income and low-middle-income countries, had to wait almost till the end of 2021 to get the share of the vaccines that they needed to vaccinate even their high priority and high risk groups. So if we see a snapshot at the beginning of 2022, when the world was supposed to have reached the WHO vaccination target of covering at least 40% of their population, there were still at least 70 countries, mostly in Africa and in Latin America, that had not yet reached that target.
2.5 years into the pandemic, over 90% of all the mRNA vaccines that were produced were supplied to rich countries. Often by the time poor countries needed them, the pandemic itself had shifted. There were variants that made these vaccines less effective. It doesn't make sense not to make as many vaccines as we can simultaneously so that as many countries and people as possible can get them simultaneously.
By vaccinating the world's most vulnerable simultaneously, it's likely that less vaccine-escaping variants would emerge. One solution put forward by many for how we can improve the spread of vaccination next time is to spread out where they're produced.
So if you try and look at the reasons behind this inequitable access, I think the thing that stands out really is the lack of regional distributed manufacturing capacity. Take the continent of Africa, for example, that manufactures less than 1% of the vaccines that they actually use. They became really dependent on donations and imports, and most of the advance purchases had been done. Export bans both on raw materials and finished goods. These also contributed, but I think the major factor was really the lack of the regional manufacturing capacity. That needs to be addressed.
The reason they're not being allowed to is because mRNA vaccines have monopolies on them. And the way that those monopolies are justified is by casting aspersions on anyone else's ability to make these vaccines. But it isn't true. There are companies who've been making vaccines at a very high quality, and they could very well do the same for their own countries and continents. They're just simply not being allowed to.
In fact, the mRNA vaccines in a way could be simpler than the ones that actually need the culturing of the virus, whereas the mRNA technology, you could say, is more chemistry rather than biology. And what we're finding is that scientists were able to create this vaccine, just from publicly available information, and have been able to successfully tech transfer that to other companies, and those are already now engaged in research in developing mRNA against other diseases.
The mRNA vaccine was reverse engineered at the mRNA Tech Transfer Hub in South Africa, an initiative launched by the World Health Organization. They had to use publicly available data to copy one of the mRNA vaccines because the original manufacturers didn't help, which would have sped up the process.
Of course, the mRNA vaccines have hundreds of components, including enzymes and lipids. Some of these are in short supply because they're also controlled by a few companies, and there are myriads of patents across many of these components. So again, a global agreement on waiving intellectual property during a pandemic would actually help advance the use of these technologies.
Thomas Quaney from the IFPMA, the association that represents most of the major vaccine manufacturers, says that when it comes to regional manufacturing, we need to be realistic about timing.
Everybody agrees that there needs to be more focus on regional manufacturing. In particular, there needs to be focus on helping Africa to develop its own manufacturing basis. At the same time, the people who really know about the challenges, they are absolutely conscious that you need skilled workforce, training of skilled workforce, you need strong regulatory system, and you need a sustainable business model. And that will not happen overnight. That's why expectation that these regional manufacturing bases will be ready in 2 or 3 years, basically, I think that's a bit of wishful thinking. That's why, in addition to these efforts, the willingness of companies to put aside part of production upfront in real time for vulnerable populations in lower income countries is equally important.
The IFPMA have worked with vaccine manufacturers to publish the so-called Berlin Declaration, which basically means that all of these major producers have agreed to allocate a proportion of their vaccines for lower income countries in a future pandemic.
This was missing this time, but doing it, we also need the support from the rich countries and from manufacturing countries, because the countries need to sign up to social contract. They need to accept that part of production will not be used for every citizen in their country, but part of it will be sent to people in need who were left behind during the COVID pandemic.
Whilst these agreed allocations to the world's most vulnerable populations will clearly need to be part of the solution if the next pandemic happens anytime soon, they do represent a status quo of handouts from higher to lower income countries. So would waiving patents on vaccines help their global supply? Thomas thinks not.
In the vaccine field, I don't believe that waiving patents will be of any good, except it might make companies think twice before they undergo the risk investing in risky research. In the therapeutics area, that's much more problematic and relevant, because in the therapeutics area, there's no way that a company could protect abuse if there's a patent waive to make sure that the treatment is only used for COVID-19 and not for something else.
And it's not just an argument about putting off investors. Thomas says the only way to ensure the quality of vaccines is if the patent holding company authorizes what's known as a voluntary license to a manufacturer. In this arrangement, there's someone who checks whether the recipient company has produced the vaccine properly and safely.
If you take away the patent, it's really a risk of being in the Wild West.
The argument that innovation must be rewarded and that IP must be protected, I think needs to be re-examined because of a couple of reasons. The first is that a lot of that intellectual property is generated in academic labs or through public funding. And that secondly, that a lot of the products that are developed here, we're talking about people's health and we're talking about life-saving technologies. It's not just a nice to have, it's a must have for people. You're saving lives.
Regardless of how intellectual property is navigated in the future, there will be challenges to maintaining sustainable vaccine manufacturers across the world. Jerome Kim from the International Vaccine Institute in Seoul, South Korea, has also been heavily involved in equipping low-income countries with the means to produce their own vaccines.
Everyone will say, yeah, regional manufacturing is great. And then the big question is, and this is something that we're struggling with, What will they make when there's no COVID vaccine to make? It's a bit like an army, right? You have an army to fight wars, but if the army doesn't train in between wars, it's not going to be able to fight effectively in the next war. So regional manufacturing will have to manufacture vaccines for endemic diseases, preferably regional endemic diseases, in order to have the capacity to respond when there's a pandemic. So IVI, working with funding from the Korean government and with the World Health Organization, is involved in the Global Biomanufacturing Training Hub. Because this isn't something that you can just do. You really do have to be trained, and failure to adhere to these will result in the failure of the vaccine to be manufactured at a high quality standard, so reproducibly. It could impact vaccine safety, and it should certainly impact the ability of regulatory authorities around the world to license the vaccine, to approve the vaccine for use in humans. So with that didactic training, then in subsequent years, people can go on to one of the WHO mRNA training hubs, or they can return for some of the advanced courses, which should start in 2023.
Of course, we don't know what pathogen is going to cause the next pandemic, so the World Health Organization has created a list of likely viral culprits.
So the next pandemic most likely is a virus and of zoonotic origin, and we have about 25 viral families, which includes influenza viruses, coronaviruses, the Henipa viruses, filoviruses, the pox viruses, just to give you a few examples from which the next pathogen could jump from animals to humans. And so having those lists and having companies investing in platform technologies and against one pathogen from that family will really help us to prepare very quickly for the next pandemic.
Finally, vaccines don't save lives until they're inside people. So another crucial aspect to this question is how we bolster capacities within countries across the world to administer vaccines to their populations.
In a high-income country, say the United States or a country in Europe, even if you had to vaccinate 40% of your population as a portion of the amount the country spends on healthcare, it's not actually that great. It's under 5%. If you were in a low-income country, to vaccinate 40% of your population could, in the case of one African country, be 40% of your healthcare budget. So you'd have to stop doing surgeries. You'd have to stop seeing children or pregnant women in order to vaccinate the adult population. And this gets to the fragility of the healthcare system. How do we fix that? Well, we're going to have to put more funding. We're going to have to get countries to commit to building up healthcare capacity so that they're at a point where people can receive routine care and that we can add things like adult vaccination onto that care.
I think we really need to work on health system resilience. We also need to work on universal health coverage. For example, I think it's not right that in a rich country such as my own, Switzerland, I could take it for granted that whoever gets the COVID jab was for free. We had quite many developing countries, the jabs had to be bought. We really need to see health security and pandemic preparedness not just as a question of health security, it's also about economic security.
Of course, money's important in terms of a country's capacity to deliver vaccines, but it could also be decisive further upstream in development in the future.
We're going to have to relieve another inequity, which is the R&D inequity. The United States could invest $20 billion in Operation Warp Speed. The European Union put $2.6 billion. CEPI put in $1.5 billion. That money did not go to the low-cost manufacturers in the developing world, even to the Indian or Chinese companies. They went to the Western pharmaceutical and biotech companies that did a remarkable job. But what would have happened if you had given one of the Indian companies $30 million to rapidly develop a vaccine against COVID? And they were able to do what they did, later on in the pandemic. Maybe we would have had hundreds of millions of doses sooner. Lots of issues, and they really have to be worked on now, because it will take a long time to solve the problem.
One of the lessons for me really from this pandemic is that investing in science and investing in research is very important. And it shouldn't be happening only in a few countries around the world. I think every country, regardless of its income status, needs to invest in science and scientists.
we need to address the shortcoming this time, which means more equitable rollout. But also, we should not forget what helped us to respond fast this time, namely to rely on the force of the private sector, of the science which was brought together. Looking at the political debate, I'm concerned that people are tempted to compromise exactly what worked so far.
I've been working on pharmaceutical monopolies for 20 years, and I've seen the death toll that monopolies have taken on people, from AIDS in South Africa to more recently cystic fibrosis in the United Kingdom. For pathogen X, or the next pandemic, and it will come, we have two choices. One, to keep this monopoly industrial complex the way it is and suffer exactly the same consequences, or find a way to dismantle it, and we can, and then we'd have a real shot at saving the world.
In the end, it's the vaccines and the arm that save people. It isn't the miraculous 11-month delivery of a vaccine that's safe and efficacious. It isn't scaling to 12 billion doses. It's actually putting those vaccines into arms. And leadership is what is required in order to think through the entire process and make sure that we don't focus only on one thing to the exclusion of the other things that are going to interfere with impact. Because in the end, it's about saving lives.